Section 4. The Mexicans, Part 2. In the fall of 1864, 20 warriors were willing to go with me on another raid into Mexico. These were all chosen men, well armed and equipped for battle. As usual, we provided for the safety of our families before starting on this raid. Our whole tribe scattered, and then reassembled at a camp about 40 miles from the former place. In this way it would be hard for the Mexicans to trail them, and we would know where to find our families when we returned. Moreover, if any hostile Indian should see this large number of warriors leaving our range, they might attack our camp, but if they found no one at the usual place, their raid would fail. We went south through the Chokonen Apaches' range, entered Sonora, Mexico at a point directly south of Tombstone, Arizona, and went into hiding in the Sierra de Atunes mountains. We attacked several settlements in the neighborhood and secured plenty of provisions and supplies. After about 3 days, we attacked and captured a mule pack train at a place called by the Indians Pontoco. It is situated in the mountains due west about 1 day's journey from Arizpe. There were 3 drivers with this train. 1 was killed and 2 escaped. The train was loaded with mezcal, which was contained in bottles held in wicker baskets. As soon as we made camp, the Indians began to get drunk and fight each other. I, too, drank enough mezcal to feel the effect of it, but I was not drunk. I ordered the fighting stopped, but the order was disobeyed. Soon almost a general fight was in progress. I tried to place a guard out around our camp, but all were drunk and refused to serve. I expected an attack from Mexican troops at any moment, and really it was a serious matter for me, for, being in command, I would be held responsible for any ill luck attending the expedition. Finally, the camp became comparatively still, for the Indians were too drunk to walk or even to fight. While they were in this stupor, I poured out all the mezcal. Then I put out all the fires and moved the pack mules to a considerable distance from camp. After this, I returned to camp to try to do something for the wounded. I found that only 2 were dangerously wounded. From the leg of one of these I cut an arrowhead, and from the shoulder of another I withdrew a spear point. When all the wounds had been cared for, I myself kept guard until morning. The next day we loaded our wounded on the pack mules and started for Arizona. The next day we captured some cattle from a herd and drove them home with us, but it was a very difficult matter to drive cattle when we were on foot. Caring for the wounded and keeping the cattle from escaping made our journey tedious, but we were not trailed and arrived safely at home with all the booty. We then gave a feast and dance and divided the spoils. After the dance we killed all the cattle and dried the meat. We dressed the hides, and then the dried meat was packed in between these hides and stored away. All that winter we had plenty of meat. These were the first cattle we ever had. As usual, we killed and ate some of the mules. We had little use for mules, and if we could not trade them for something of value, we killed them. In the summer of 1865, with 4 warriors, I went again into Mexico. Heretofore we had gone on foot. We were accustomed to fight on foot. Besides, we could more easily conceal ourselves when dismounted. But this time we wanted more cattle, and it was hard to drive them when we were on foot. We entered Sonora at a point southwest from Tombstone, Arizona, and followed the Sierra de Atunes mountains to the southern limit. Then crossed the country as far south as the mouth of Yaqui River. Here we saw a great lake, the Gulf of California, extending beyond the limit of sight. Then we turned north, attacked several settlements, and secured plenty of supplies. When we had come back northwest of Arizpe, we secured about 60 head of cattle, and drove them to our homes in Arizona. We did not go directly home, but camped in different valleys with our cattle. We were not trailed. When we arrived at our camp, the tribe was again assembled for feasting and dancing. Presents were given to everybody. Then the cattle were killed and the meat dried and packed. Chapter 9. Varying Fortunes. In the fall of 1865, with 9 other warriors, I went into Mexico on foot. We attacked several settlements south of Casa Grande and collected many horses and mules. We made our way northward with these animals through the mountains. When near Arispe, we made camp one evening, and, thinking that we were not being trailed, turned loose the whole herd, even those we had been riding. They were in a valley surrounded by steep mountains, and we were camped at the mouth of this valley, so that the animals could not leave without coming through our camp. Just as we had begun to eat our supper, our scouts came in and announced Mexican troops coming toward our camp. We started for the horses, but troops that our scouts had not seen were on the cliffs above us and opened fire. We scattered in all directions, and the troops recovered all our booty. In 3 days we reassembled at our appointed place of rendezvous in the Sierra Madre Mountains in northern Sonora. Mexican troops did not follow us, and we returned to Arizona without any more fighting, and with no booty. Again I had nothing to say, but I was anxious for another raid. Early the next summer, 1866, I took 30 mounted warriors and invaded Mexican territory. We went south through Chihuahua as far as Santa Cruz, Sonora, then crossed over the Sierra Madre Mountains, following the river course at the south end of the range. We kept on westward from the Sierra Madre Mountains to the Sierra de Sahuaripa Mountains, and followed that range northward. We collected all the horses, mules, and cattle we wanted, and drove them northward through Sonora into Arizona. Mexicans saw us at many times and in many places, but they did not attack us at any time, nor did any troops attempt to follow us. When we arrived at our homes we gave presents to all, and the tribe feasted and danced. During this raid we had killed about 50 Mexicans. The next year, 1867, Mangus Colorado led 8 warriors on a raid into Mexico. I went as a warrior, for I was always glad to fight the Mexicans. We rode south from near Tombstone, Arizona, into Sonora, Mexico. We attacked some cowboys, and, after a fight with them, in which 2 of their number were killed, we drove all their cattle northward. The second day we were driving the cattle, but had no scouts out. When we were not far from Arispe, Mexican troops rode upon us. They were well armed and well mounted, and when we first saw them they were not half a mile away from us. We left the cattle and rode as hard as we could toward the mountains, but they gained on us rapidly. Soon they opened fire, but were so far away from us that we were unable to reach them with our arrows. Finally we reached some timber, and, leaving our ponies, fought from cover. Then the Mexicans halted, collected our ponies, and rode away across the plains toward Arispe, driving the cattle with them. We stood and watched them until they disappeared in the distance, and then took up our march for home. We arrived home in 5 days with no victory to report, no spoils to divide, and not even the ponies which we had ridden into Mexico. This expedition was considered disgraceful. The warriors who had been with Mangus Colorado on this last expedition wanted to return to Mexico. They were not satisfied. Besides, they felt keenly the taunts of the other warriors. Mangus Colorado would not lead them back, so I took command and we went on foot, directly toward Arispe in Sonora, and made our camp in the Sierra de Sahuaripa Mountains. There were only 6 of us, but we raided several settlements at night, captured many horses and mules, and loaded them with provisions, saddles, and blankets. Then we returned to Arizona, traveling only at night. When we arrived at our camp, we sent out scouts to prevent any surprise by Mexicans, assembled the tribe, feasted, danced, and divided the spoils. Mangus Colorado would not receive any of this booty, but we did not care. No Mexican troops followed us to Arizona. About a year after this, 1868, Mexican troops rounded up all the horses and mules of the tribe not far from our settlement. No raids had been made into Mexico that year, and we were not expecting any attacks. We were all in camp, having just returned from hunting. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 Mexican scouts were seen near our settlement. We killed these scouts, but the troops got under way with the herd of our horses and mules before we saw them. It was useless to try to overtake them on foot, and our tribe had not a horse left. I took 20 warriors and trailed them. We found the stock at a cattle ranch in Sonora, not far from Nacozari, and attacked the cowboys who had them in charge. We killed 2 men and lost none. After the fight, we drove off our own stock and all of theirs. We were trailed by 9 cowboys. I sent the stock on ahead, and with 3 warriors stayed in the rear to intercept any attacking parties. One night, when near the Arizona line, we discovered these cowboys on our trail and watched them camp for the night and picket their horses. About midnight, we stole into their camp and silently led away all their horses, leaving the cowboys asleep. Then we rode hard and overtook our companions, who always traveled at night instead of in the daytime. We turned these horses in with the herd and fell back to again intercept anyone who might trail us. What these 9 cowboys did next morning I do not know, and I have never heard the Mexicans say anything about it. I know they did not follow us, for we were not molested. When we arrived in camp at home, there was great rejoicing in the tribe. It was considered a good trick to get the Mexicans' horses and leave them asleep in the mountains. It was a long time before we again went into Mexico or were disturbed by the Mexicans. Chapter 10. Other Raids. When reading the foregoing chapters of Apache raids, one not acquainted with the lawlessness of the frontier might wonder how this tendency of the Apaches was developed to such a marked degree, but one acquainted with the real conditions, the disregard for law by both Mexicans and white men along the border line of Old Mexico and Arizona in early days, can readily understand where the Apache got his education in the art of conducting lawless raids. In order, therefore, that those who are unacquainted with the conditions as they were in southern Arizona during the 80s may understand the environment of the Apaches, this chapter is given. The events herein narrated are taken by the author from many accounts given him by reliable men who lived in this section of country during the period mentioned. Raid by white men. In 1882, a company of 6 Mexican traders, who were known as smugglers because they evaded duties on goods which they brought into the United States and sold in Arizona, were camped in Skeleton Canyon, 10 miles north of the north line of Old Mexico. They were known to carry large sums of money, but as they were always armed and ready to defend their possessions, they were not often molested. However, on this occasion, just as they were rising in the morning to prepare their breakfast, 5 white men opened fire on them from ambush, and all save one of the Mexicans were killed. This one, though wounded, finally made his escape. A few days after the killing, some cowboys on a roundup camped at this place and buried the remains, what the coyotes had left, of these 5 Mexicans. 2 years later, at the same place, a cowboy found a leather bag containing 72 Mexican dollars, which small amount of money had been overlooked by the robbers. The men who did this killing lived in Arizona for many years afterwards, and although it was known that they had committed the depredation, no arrests followed, and no attempt was made by any of the Mexicans to recover the property of their fellow citizens. Mexican Raid. In 1884, a cattleman and 4 cowboys from his ranch started to drive some fat cattle to market at Tombstone, Arizona. The route they took led partly through Old Mexico and partly through Arizona. One night they camped in a canyon just south of the Mexican border. Next morning at daylight, the cowboy who had been on herd duty the last half of the night had just come in and aroused the camp when the Mexicans opened fire on them from ambush. The cattleman and one of the cowboys were severely wounded at the first volley and took shelter behind the camp wagon, from which position they fired as long as their ammunition lasted. The other 3 were only slightly wounded and reached cover, but only one escaped with his life. He remained in hiding for 2 days before his comrades found him. He saw the Mexicans rob the bodies of the dead and lead away their saddle horses, after having cooked breakfast for themselves in the deserted camp. He was severely wounded, and all his ammunition was gone, hence he could only wait. On the 2nd day after this raid, some of the cattle strayed back to the old ranch, thereby giving notice to the cowboys that there had been foul play. They found their wounded companions lying delirious near the decaying bodies of their comrades. No arrests were ever made in Mexico for these murders, and no attempt was made to recover damage or prosecute the robbers. The 2 instances above narrated will serve to show the reader what kind of an example was set for the Apaches by at least a portion of the inhabitants of the 2 Christian nations with whom they came in contact. Apache Raids. It is thought well to give in this chapter some of the depredations of the Apaches not told by Geronimo. They are given as told by our own citizens and from the white man's point of view. In 1884, Judge McCormick and wife, accompanied by their young son, were driving from Silver City to Lordsburg when they were ambushed by Apaches. The bodies of the adults were found soon afterward, but the child's body was never recovered. Years afterward, an Apache squaw told some of the settlers in Arizona that the little boy, about 8 years old, cried so much and was so stubborn that they had to kill him, although their original intention was to spare his life. In 1882, a man named Hunt was wounded in a row in a saloon in Tombstone, Arizona. During this row, 2 other men had been killed, and to avoid arrest, Hunt and his brother went into the mountains and camped about 10 miles north of Willow Springs to await the healing of his wounds. A few days after they came there, Apache Indians attacked them and killed the wounded brother, but the other, by hard riding, made good his escape. In 1883, 2 Eastern boys went into Arizona to prospect. Their real outing began at Willow Springs, where they had stayed 2 days with the cowboys. These cowboys had warned them against the Apaches, but the young men seemed entirely fearless and pushed on into the mountains. On the 2nd morning after they left the settlement, one of the boys was getting breakfast while the other went to bring in the pack horses that had been hobbled and turned loose the night before to graze. Just about the time he found the horses, 2 Apache warriors rode out from cover toward him, and he made a hasty retreat to camp, jumping off of a bluff and in so doing breaking his leg. A consultation was then held between the 2 Easterners, and it was decided that perhaps all the stories they had been told of the Apache raids were true, and that it was advisable to surrender. Accordingly, a white handkerchief was tied to the end of a pole and raised cautiously above the top of the bluff. In about 10 minutes the 2 Indians, one a very old warrior and the other a mere boy, evidently his son, rode into camp and dismounted. The old warrior examined the broken limb, then without a word proceeded to take off the shirt of the uninjured youth, with strips of which he carefully bound up the broken leg. After this the 2 Indians ate the prepared breakfast and remounted their ponies. Then the old warrior, indicating the direction with his thumb, said, "Doctor, Lordsburg, 3 days," and silently rode away. The young men rode 25 miles to San Simony, where the cowboys fitted them out with a wagon to continue their journey to Lordsburg, 75 miles further, where a physician's services could be secured. In 1883, 2 prospectors, Alberts and Reese by name, were driving a team consisting of a horse and a mule through Turkey Creek bottoms when they were shot by the Indians. The wagon and harness were left in the road, and the mule was found dead in the road 200 yards from that place. Evidently the Indians had not much use for him. The guns of the prospectors were found later, but the horse they drove was not recovered. In none of the above-named instances were the bodies of the victims mutilated. However, there are many recorded instances in which the Apache Indians did mutilate the bodies of their victims, but it is claimed by Geronimo that these were outlawed Indians, as his regular warriors were instructed to scalp none except those killed in battle, and to torture none except to make them reveal desired information. In 1884, 2 cowboys in the employment of the Sansimone Cattle Company were camped at Willow Springs, 18 miles southwest of Skeleton Canyon, and not far from Old Mexico. Just at sundown their camp was surrounded by Apaches in war paint, who said they had been at war with the Mexicans and wished to return to the United States. There were about 75 Indians in the whole tribe, the squaws and children coming up later. They had with them about 150 Mexican horses. The Indians took possession of the camp and remained for about 10 days, getting their supplies of meat by killing cattle of the company. With this band of Indians was a white boy about 14 years old, who had evidently been with them from infancy, for he could not speak a word of English and did not understand much Spanish, but spoke the Apache language readily. They would allow but one of the cowboys to leave camp at a time, keeping the other under guard. They had sentinels with spyglasses on all the hills and peaks surrounding the camp. One evening, when one of the cowboys, William Byrne, had been allowed to pass out of the camp, he noticed an Indian dismounted and, as he approached, discovered that the Indian had him under range of his rifle. He immediately dismounted and, standing on the opposite side from the redskin, threw his own Winchester across his horse's neck, when the Indian sprang on his horse and galloped toward him at full speed, making signs to him not to shoot, and when he approached him, dismounted and, pointing to the ground, showed Byrne many fresh deer tracks. Then, as an understanding had been established, the cowboy remounted and went on his way, leaving the Apache to hunt the deer. One day when this cowboy was about 10 miles from camp, he found 2 splendid horses of the Indians. These horses had strayed from the herd. Thinking that they would in a way compensate for the cattle the Apaches were eating, he drove them on for about 5 miles into a canyon where there was plenty of grass and water, and left them there, intending to come back after the departure of the Indians and take possession of them. On the 10th day after the arrival of this band of Indians, United States troops, accompanied by 2 Indians who had been sent to make the arrangements, arrived in camp, paid for the cattle the Apaches had eaten, took the Indians and their stock, and moved on towards Fort Bowie. The cowboys immediately started for the canyon where the 2 horses had been left, but had not gone far when they met 2 Indians driving these horses in front of them as they pushed on to overtake the tribe. Evidently the shrewdness of the paleface had not outwitted the red man that time. Geronimo says he was in no wise connected with the events herein mentioned, but refuses to state whether he knows anything about them. He holds it unmanly to tell of any depredations of red men except those for which he was responsible. Such were the events transpiring in Apache land during the days when Geronimo was leading his warriors to avenge the wrongs of his people. This chapter will serve to show that the Apache had plenty of examples of lawlessness furnished him, and also that he was a very apt scholar in this school of savage lawlessness. End of Part 2 of the Mexicans. Section 5, Part 3 of the Mexicans, and Part 1 of the White Men. The Mexicans, Part 3, Chapter 11, Heavy Fighting. About 1873 we were again attacked by Mexican troops in our settlement, but we defeated them. Then we decided to make raids into Mexico. We moved our whole camp, packing all our belongings on mules and horses, went into Mexico, and made camp in the mountains near Nacori. In moving our camp in this way, we wanted no one to spy on us, and if we passed a Mexican's home, we usually killed the inmates. However, if they offered to surrender and made no resistance or trouble in any way, we would take them prisoners. Frequently we would change our place of rendezvous. Then we would take with us our prisoners if they were willing to go, but if they were unruly they might be killed. I remember one Mexican in the Sierra Madre Mountains who saw us moving and delayed us for some time. We took the trouble to get him, thinking the plunder of his house would pay us for the delay, but after we had killed him we found nothing in his house worth having. We ranged in these mountains for over a year, raiding the Mexican settlements for our supplies, but not having any general engagement with Mexican troops. Then we returned to our homes in Arizona. After remaining in Arizona about a year, we returned to Mexico and went into hiding in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Our camp was near Nacori, and we had just organized bands of warriors for raiding the country when our scouts discovered Mexican troops coming toward our camp to attack us. Battle of White Hill. The chief of the Nedni Apaches, Ho, was with me, and commanded one division. The warriors were all marched toward the troops and met them at a place about 5 miles from our camp. We showed ourselves to the soldiers, and they quickly rode to the top of a hill and dismounted, placing their horses on the outside for breastworks. It was a round hill, very steep and rocky, and there was no timber on its sides. There were 2 companies of Mexican cavalry, and we had about 60 warriors. We crept up the hill behind the rocks, and they kept up a constant fire, but I had cautioned our warriors not to expose themselves to the Mexicans. I knew that the troopers would waste their ammunition. Soon we had killed all their horses, but the soldiers would lie behind these and shoot at us. While we had killed several Mexicans, we had not yet lost a man. However, it was impossible to get very close to them in this way, and I deemed it best to lead a charge against them. We had been fighting ever since about 1 o'clock, and about the middle of the afternoon, seeing that we were making no further progress, I gave the sign for the advance. The war whoop sounded, and we leaped forward from every stone over the Mexicans' dead horses, fighting hand to hand. The attack was so sudden that the Mexicans, running first this way and then that, became so confused that in a few minutes we had killed them all. Then we scalped the slain, carried away our dead, and secured all the arms we needed. That night we moved our camp eastward through the Sierra Madre Mountains into Chihuahua. No troops molested us here, and after about a year we returned to Arizona. Almost every year we would live a part of the time in Old Mexico. There were at this time many settlements in Arizona. Game was not plentiful, and besides we liked to go down into Old Mexico. Besides, the lands of the Nedni Apaches, our friends and kinsmen, extended far into Mexico. Their chief, Ho, was as a brother to me, and we spent much of our time in his territory. About 1880 we were in camp in the mountains south of Casa Grande when a company of Mexican troops attacked us. There were 24 Mexican soldiers and about 40 Indians. The Mexicans surprised us in camp and fired on us, killing 2 Indians the first volley. I do not know how they were able to find our camp unless they had excellent scouts and our guards were careless, but there they were shooting at us before we knew they were near. We were in the timber, and I gave the order to go forward and fight at close range. We kept behind rocks and trees until we came within 10 yards of their line. Then we stood up, and both sides shot until all the Mexicans were killed. We lost 12 warriors in this battle. This place was called by the Indians Scolata. When we had buried our dead and secured what supplies the Mexicans had, we went northeast. At a place near Nacori, Mexican troops attacked us. At this place, called by the Indians Nacode, There were about 80 warriors, Bedonkohe and Nedni Apaches. There were 3 companies of Mexican troops. They attacked us in an open field, and we scattered, firing as we ran. They followed us, but we dispersed and soon were free from their pursuit. Then we reassembled in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Here a council was held, and as Mexican troops were coming from many quarters, we disbanded. In about 4 months we reassembled at Casa Grande to make a treaty of peace. The chiefs of the town of Casa Grande and all of the men of Casa Grande made a treaty with us. We shook hands and promised to be brothers. Then we began to trade, and the Mexicans gave us mezcal. Soon nearly all the Indians were drunk. While they were drunk, 2 companies of Mexican troops from another town attacked us, killed 20 Indians, and captured many more. We fled in all directions. Chapter 12. Geronimo's Mightiest Battle. After the treachery and massacre of Casa Grande, we did not reassemble for a long while, and when we did, we returned to Arizona. We remained in Arizona for some time, living in San Carlos Reservation, at a place now called Geronimo. In 1883 we went into Mexico again. We remained in the mountain ranges of Mexico for about 14 months, and during this time we had many skirmishes with Mexican troops. In 1884 we returned to Arizona to get other Apaches to come with us into Mexico. The Mexicans were gathering troops in the mountains where we had been ranging, and their numbers were so much greater than ours that we could not hope to fight them successfully, and we were tired of being chased about from place to place. In Arizona we had trouble with the United States soldiers, explained in next chapter, and returned to Mexico. We had lost about 15 warriors in Arizona and had gained no recruits. With our reduced number we camped in the mountains north of Arispe. Mexican troops were seen by our scouts in several directions. The United States troops were coming down from the north. We were well armed with guns and supplied with ammunition, but we did not care to be surrounded by the troops of 2 governments, so we started to move our camp southward. One night we made camp some distance from the mountains by a stream. There was not much water in the stream, but a deep channel was worn through the prairie, and small trees were beginning to grow here and there along the bank of this stream. In those days we never camped without placing scouts, for we knew that we were liable to be attacked at any time. The next morning, just at daybreak, our scouts came in, aroused the camp, and notified us that Mexican troops were approaching. Within 5 minutes the Mexicans began firing on us. We took to the ditches made by the stream, and had the women and children busy digging these deeper. I gave strict orders to waste no ammunition and keep under cover. We killed many Mexicans that day, and in turn lost heavily, for the fight lasted all day. Frequently troops would charge at one point, be repulsed, then rally and charge at another point. About noon we began to hear them speaking my name with curses. In the afternoon the general came on the field, and the fighting became more furious. I gave orders to my warriors to try to kill all the Mexican officers. About 3 o'clock the general called all the officers together at the right side of the field. The place where they assembled was not very far from the main stream, and a little ditch ran out close to where the officers stood. Cautiously I crawled out this ditch, very close to where the council was being held. The general was an old warrior. The wind was blowing in my direction so that I could hear all he said, and I understood most of it. This is about what he told them. "Officers, yonder in those ditches is the Red Devil Geronimo and his hated band. This must be his last day. Ride on him from both sides of the ditches. Kill men, women, and children. Take no prisoners. Dead Indians are what we want. Do not spare your own men. Exterminate this band at any cost. I will post the wounded to shoot all deserters. Go back to your companies and advance." Just as the command to go forward was given, I took deliberate aim at the general, and he fell. In an instant the ground around me was riddled with bullets, but I was untouched. The Apaches had seen. From all along the ditches arose the fierce war cry of my people. The columns wavered an instant and then swept on. They did not retreat until our fire had destroyed the front ranks. After this their fighting was not so fierce, yet they continued to rally and re-advance until dark. They also continued to speak my name with threats and curses. That night, before the firing had ceased, a dozen Indians had crawled out of the ditches and set fire to the long prairie grass behind the Mexican troops. During the confusion that followed, we escaped to the mountains. This was the last battle that I ever fought with Mexicans. United States troops were trailing us continually from this time until the treaty was made with General Miles in Skeleton Canyon. During my many wars with the Mexicans, I received 8 wounds, as follows: shot in the right leg above the knee, and still carry the bullet; shot through the left forearm; wounded in the right leg below the knee with a saber; wounded on top of the head with the butt of a musket; shot just below the outer corner of the left eye; shot in the left side; shot in the back. I have killed many Mexicans. I do not know how many, for frequently I did not count them. Some of them were not worth counting. It has been a long time since then, but still I have no love for the Mexicans. With me they were always treacherous and malicious. I am old now, and shall never go on the warpath again. But if I were young, and followed the warpath, it would lead into old Mexico. Part 3. The White Men. Chapter 13. Coming of the White Men. About the time of the massacre of Kaskiyeh, 1858, we heard that some white men were measuring land to the south of us. In company with a number of other warriors, I went to visit them. We could not understand them very well, for we had no interpreter, but we made a treaty with them by shaking hands and promising to be brothers. Then we made our camp near their camp, and they came to trade with us. We gave them buckskin, blankets, and ponies in exchange for shirts and provisions. We also brought them game, for which they gave us some money. We did not know the value of this money, but we kept it, and later learned from the Navajo Indians that it was very valuable. Every day they measured land with curious instruments, and put down marks which we could not understand. They were good men, and we were sorry when they had gone on into the West. They were not soldiers. These were the first white men I ever saw. About 10 years later some more white men came. These were all warriors. They made their camp on the Gila River south of Hot Springs. At first they were friendly, and we did not dislike them, but they were not as good as those who came first. After about a year some trouble arose between them and the Indians, and I took the warpath as a warrior, not as a chief. I had not been wronged, but some of my people had been, and I fought with my tribe, for the soldiers and not the Indians were at fault. Not long after this, some of the officers of the United States troops invited our leaders to hold a conference at Apache Pass, Fort Bowie. Just before noon the Indians were shown into a tent and told that they would be given something to eat. When in the tent they were attacked by soldiers. Our chief, Mangus Colorado, and several other warriors, by cutting through the tent, escaped, but most of the warriors were killed or captured. Among the Badonkahe Apaches killed at this time were Sansa, Quadetaje, Nicocaje, and Gopi. After this treachery, the Indians went back to the mountains and left the fort entirely alone. I do not think that the agent had anything to do with planning this, for he had always treated us well. I believe it was entirely planned by the soldiers. From the very first, the soldiers sent out to our western country, and the officers in charge of them, did not hesitate to wrong the Indians. They never explained to the government when an Indian was wronged, but always reported the misdeeds of the Indians. Much that was done by mean white men was reported at Washington as the deeds of my people. The Indians always tried to live peaceably with the white soldiers and settlers. One day, during the time that the soldiers were stationed at Apache Pass, I made a treaty with the post. This was done by shaking hands and promising to be brothers. Cochise and Mangus Colorado did likewise. I do not know the name of the officer in command, but this was the first regiment that ever came to Apache Pass. This treaty was made about a year before we were attacked in a tent, as above related. In a few days after the attack at Apache Pass, we organized in the mountains and returned to fight the soldiers. There were two tribes, the Bedonkohe and the Chokonen Apaches, both commanded by Cochise. After a few days' skirmishing, we attacked a freight train that was coming in with supplies for the fort. We killed some of the men and captured the others. These prisoners our chief offered to trade for the Indians whom the soldiers had captured at the massacre in the tent. This the officers refused, so we killed our prisoners, disbanded, and went into hiding in the mountains. Of those who took part in this affair, I am the only one now living. In a few days troops were sent out to search for us, but as we were disbanded, it was, of course, impossible for them to locate any hostile camp. During the time they were searching for us, many of our warriors, who were thought by the soldiers to be peaceable Indians, talked to the officers and men, advising them where they might find the camp they sought, and while they searched, we watched them from our hiding places and laughed at their failures. After this trouble, all of the Indians agreed not to be friendly with the white men any more. There was no general engagement, but a long struggle followed. Sometimes we attacked the white men, sometimes they attacked us. First a few Indians would be killed, and then a few soldiers. I think the killing was about equal on each side. The number killed in these troubles did not amount to much, but this treachery on the part of the soldiers had angered the Indians and revived memories of other wrongs, so that we never again trusted the United States troops. End of Part 1 of The White Men.